today to discuss early years and looking at what needs to change to make the UK the best place to raise happy and healthy children. I'm Alice Wilcock and I'm Head of Education, and I have the great pleasure of chairing today. Before we get started, I just want to say a couple of thank yous. So thank you to our panel, who are experts in this space, for sharing your time and expertise with us. And thank you to UNICEF, who, without your support, none of this would be possible. The early years are crucial to many important life outcomes, from health to well-being. But too many children continue to fall behind in their first years. Many are not ready to learn by the age of 5 and struggle with health and well-being. At 3 years old, a child growing up in poverty is nearly 1.5 years behind their more affluent peers when it comes to early language development. I think we can all agree that this needs to change, and this is an area where politicians are leading the talk change in this. Last year, the Early Years Health and Development Review was published, chaired by Andrea Leadsom MP, who joins us in this panel, and advised by a range of parliamentarians, including Miriam MP, who also joins us in this discussion. So we want to focus today on access to support in the early years. You'll have noticed it's quite a packed panel, so I'm going to hand over to everyone to do their brief introductory remarks, and the format will be Q&A. So start thinking about your questions that you want to ask, they'll be rolling mics. But without further ado, our panellists are Right Honourable Andrea Leadsom, DP MP, Chair of the Early Years Health and Development Review and MP for South Northamptonshire, John Sparks, CEO of UNICEF UK, Miriam MP, Parliamentary Advisor to the Early Years Health and Development Review, Education Select Committee Member and MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, Carey, Oppenheim, a leading researcher on the early years at the Nuffield Foundation, and Dr. Sally Smith, CEO of Peeple, a brilliant alliance charity supporting parents with children's learning. So I'm going to hand over for opening remarks to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Alice. And this is my absolute passion in politics. It's been my passion for getting on for 25 years now, because I was obviously a child myself when I first became interested in this. But the first comment I just want to make is that human beings are unique in the animal kingdom. We are unique. If you think about a cat or an elephant or a tiger, they are born and they stand up and look around, they start feeding, they start fending for themselves, they're off having fun within a few hours or days of being born. Human animals are born totally incapable, okay? Totally incapable. And there's very strong evolutionary reasons for that human beings are born physically, tiny little arms, cute big heads, lovely big, gorgeous eyes. And that is all designed to make you love me, to make you look after me, and I cry and no one can ignore a baby's cry. It's all designed to make you help that baby to survive, because human babies are unable to fend for themselves at all until they're at least a year old. And very, very little, a human baby can do very little for themselves until they're 2 years old. Hence, when we set up the 1001 Critical Days in 2011, it was to recognise that that critical period, the physical underdevelopment is only a part of it. The brain is only partially formed at birth. So the brain, the human brain, keeps on developing and growing and changing. And it changes in accordance with the earliest experiences of the baby, right from the womb through to actually around 3 or 4 years. And then again, the brain can change in puberty. But the critical period for development is conception to the age of 2, and the peak period for the development of the social and empathetic part of the brain is 6 months to 18 months. And how that social and empathetic, that part of the brain that enables you to be happy, have fun, regulate your own anger, your own jealousy, your unhappiness, your desire to be a victim or to bully other people, that social and empathetic part of the brain isn't there when you're born. You know, as a baby, you can cry, you can sleep, and you can lie there and look around, and you can be cute, and that's all you can do as a baby. And it's over time, according to the experiences that you have, that will enable your brain to piece things together and finally to think, that's my mum, when she appears, everything's fine. So after about 3 to 6 months, a baby securely attached to his or her mum will, when she turns up, stop crying. And possibly when dad turns up too, if dad is a very good secondary attachment caregiver, or could be a carer or a grandparent. It doesn't have to be mum, but for most babies, it is mum, is the one who is the person on whom you are utterly dependent to keep you alive for that first year or two of life. So if you sort of think about that as the backdrop, what happens to you in that period profoundly impacts on the development of your prefrontal cortex and on the neural connections that your brain makes. And you as a baby can either learn that actually the world's a great place, people are generally nice to me, when something's wrong I don't know that I've just done the most enormous poo, or that I'm hungry, or I've got wind, or I'm just bored, but someone came along and now I feel better. So generally you associate this coming along, you don't know that's your mum or your dad, but feeling better, and then your brain is learning that as an instinct for life. Change that and think about the baby that's born into a family where there's alcohol or some other substance misuse, or there's domestic violence, or there's deep depression. So sometimes when I cry, this comes along and I feel better. Other times this comes along and I feel worse, and I don't know that I was hit or burned or shaken. I just know I feel worse. So for a baby, those neural connections are thinking, oh, I don't really know what. And that's known over a long period of time as disorganized attachment, and those outcomes are the worst outcomes for babies in the world. So anyway, you get the drift. Secure attachment, good. Insecure attachment, less good, but survivable. Disorganized attachment, disastrous. And these things can be changed in that first 1001 critical days, and potentially later on. We never give up on anyone. You can learn to deal with things. And there are all sorts of interesting statistics about how a baby that's abused early on, if they develop a healthy relationship, perhaps with their lifelong partner or a good friend or a grandparent, that can change for them. So I'm not saying we give up on people, but the potential, the building blocks for emotional, lifelong, mental and physical well-being are laid down in that first 1001 critical days. So just very quickly, where are we? The government is persuaded of that. And actually the Labour Party is persuaded of that, and so are the Greens, and so are the Liberal Democrats. There is massive cross-party consensus on this, and that has to stay. You know, Carey and I were just agreeing, you know, we never disagree politically about whether we should have a reception class, do we? Or whether we should perhaps scrap GCSEs because they were a Tory idea or a Labour idea, so we're just going to ditch them. We don't do that, do we? So why is it that when it comes to support for the fundamental, most important part of the human being's development, we argue politically about it? So what we have to do is to have a consensus. You know, if things aren't working well in that early years period, we change it and improve it. We don't scrap it. And for far too long, that is what's happened. And there's this big row, well, you shut Sure Starts. Well, actually, no, we didn't. Local authorities decided to cut those budgets to prioritise other things. Why did they do that? Is because there was not the institutional recognition of the vital importance of the 1001 critical days. So we now do have, with the Early Years Healthy Development Review, we have widespread agreement, cross-party, cross-government and opposition, that this is a critical period of life. So what we're doing is we're rolling out across England, it's an England policy because it's a devolved matter, we're rolling out family hubs, which are a safe place for families to go, a welcoming place, where they can get support for parenting, for midwifery support, so antenatal meetings, health visiting support, breastfeeding support, mental health support, parenting support, a nice place to hang out, somewhere where dad can come with the toddler or the baby, somewhere where mum can come and down the corridor if there's domestic violence issues or debt issues or couple counselling needed, you can just go down the corridor and it's all there. So a welcoming place, a sort of specialist place, which also has a virtual world, because so many parents have told us that actually during the COVID pandemic it was very useful at times. If you've got a question or you need urgent help and the bus isn't due for another 2 hours and the baby's crying and the toddler's got to go to school, blah, 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 much better to be able to use Zoom or a phone. And actually that's one thing that actually COVID has helped us to achieve, is that virtual space. So family hubs will be the physical and the virtual space, and potentially the outreach space in local church halls, and possibly even on a local mobile bus system in rural areas. And in that space will be delivered the joined up set of Start for Life services, to include, as I say, midwifery, health visiting, mental health support, breastfeeding support, safeguarding support, disability support, parenting advice, plus a whole universal plus set of services. And then in addition to that, we're creating what's known as a digital version of the Red Book, and that will revolutionise things. You'll all know the plastic red book that we all lose. We heard in Faith's webinar review from 2 carers of new babies who cared for 40 babies between them, only ever had 2 red books turn up. And for a baby to be taken into care, dreadful things will have happened, but those carers were not given any information about what that was. How helpful is that? So actually a digital version of the red book, and for my money, I want to see babies own their own health note. So at the moment, when you're born live, you're given a national insurance number. You're not given it before you're born. Therefore, if your mum was on 40 fags a day and 2 bottles of gin a week, or injecting heroin every day, that's not in your health notes, it's in her health notes. So if you're taken away from the delivery suite, no one ever knows what happened to you. So in my view, actually we need to go into potentially the 2nd trimester and start actually enabling a baby and then a child to have their own lifelong health notes for parents to be able to communicate with health providers. So that actual digital version of the Red Book, I think, is a game changer. That will be delivered in full probably by early 2025. But in the meantime, we're rolling out this family hub, joined up set of Start for Life services in 75 upper tier local authority areas. And those will be rolled out by mid-2024. And then at the next comprehensive spending review, I'll be pitching for the money to roll it out to the other 75. Then that will be across every local authority area in England by probably 2027. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Alice.
Brilliant. Well, good luck, John.
Yeah, follow that. Hi, I'm John Sparks, Chief Executive of UNICEF UK, and interestingly, my 2nd consecutive year of sitting on a CSJ panel. Except this time last year, I was sitting on a CSJ panel talking about homelessness, and predominantly talking about homelessness amongst adults. And actually, if we get this stuff right, there'll be less need for that panel. One of the biggest statistical predictors of adult homelessness is the sort of childhood that Andrea was just talking about. So just fascinating for me to be going way upstream into prevention of the thing I was talking about last year, and just actually delighted to hear from Andrea and just pay tribute to her personal and political commitment to this subject over many years, and you heard the level of depth and expertise that she has gone to on this subject. So just really delighted I could have sat and listened to that for a lot longer, and thankfully I have the opportunity at lunchtime to hear some more. Clearly a lot of the context for babies and toddlers at the moment, we know, we see it on the news, we hear it on the news, we know the impact that things like the pandemic might have. We don't know the impact it has had, but we know what it might have. We know the impact of being brought up in a household where we might not be able to afford to put the heating on, or we're having to make horrific choices between eating, feeding, and so on. So we understand the context, and that just means that the work of parents and carers and service providers and communities has never been more vital to get right around the time in life that Andrea has been talking about. And I've spent not the same amount of time and the same amount of depth, but when you've brought up 5 children over the last 30 years, you start to understand some of the things that Andrea is talking about. And professionally, as I say, I've worked the last 80 years on the subject of homelessness and just seen the consequences if we don't get this right. A little bit on UNICEF in the UK. So for 50 years, we've been working to advocate for lasting change for children here in the UK. The programmes that we deliver alongside hospitals, alongside schools, alongside local authorities, currently reach about 2.5 million children in this country. And indeed, here in Birmingham, there are 268 schools that are part of the Rights Respecting Schools Award programme. All maternity services in Birmingham are engaged with the UNICEF UK baby-friendly initiative and progressing towards accreditation. And for those from local government, certainly myself and my team would be interested in talking to you about the Child-Friendly Cities and Communities initiative as well. Just indulge me for a second. So, we all know the sort of phrases about it takes a village to raise a child, or it takes a community to raise a child. I'm just really interested in how much of that community and village is in the room. So just indulge me with this, but just maybe raise your hands if you're a parent or a carer. Keep them up. If you're a grandparent, or no, keep the hands up. You've already got a bonus for being a parent. If you're a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, add your hands to that. If you're a godparent, if you work with children, if you work for a local authority that represents babies, toddlers and children in your constituency, etc., etc. So just point made. There's a lot of people caring for a lot of children in the room at the moment, and I'm just hoping today's conversation takes us in a good direction. So we've heard the direction of travel from Andrea, and obviously I welcome, particularly the final part, pitching for the money at the next spending review to finish the job. Particularly, we'll be interested in talking about that and how I think all of us can support that direction of travel. Because what we've got at the moment, and we've got some research coming out in a couple of weeks, is a lot of difference across the patch, and it's no wonder given that we're partway through that rollout. That's not a criticism, but patchy take up of the services, patchy ability to access professionals and access services. Last year, for example, 150,000 children missed out on their entitlement to free childcare, and that's missing out on an entitlement that's there, as opposed to the entitlement not being there. And just to give an example of how those differences play out, here in the West Midlands, more children receive their health visitor checks than in other parts of the country, but there isn't a single specialist parent-infant relationship team, and there's been a 29% drop in childcare sufficiency since 2015 in this area. So you can see some highs and some lows there, and as I'll come on to at the end, what we're really keen to see as a guarantee, so that doesn't happen, and that clearly is the direction of travel. So a little bit, I think Andrea speaks just way better than I can about the direction of travel for government, and certainly that expansion of family hubs, I think we see as absolutely key. The expansion of the Start for Life offer to all local authorities, absolutely key. And sooner the better. So final bit, what's UNICEF UK's interest and proposal? Firstly, absolutely building on what we've heard, but an increased national, regional and local vision and leadership for early years, and particularly embedding it in other areas of policy, whether that's levelling up, whether that's regeneration, whatever it is, to improve outcomes by the age of 5. Greater investment, and as we've heard, the direction of travel, but greater investment so that all children benefit from this, wherever they happen to be born and whatever kind of family circumstances they happen to be born into. And finally, to support that point on data, improved data and improved transparency to make sure we really are joining the dots in the system. On Tuesday the 18th of October, we'll be launching a campaign from UNICEF UK asking for a commitment support for a baby and toddler guarantee to make sure these rights exist across the piece. If you're interested in more information, scan the QR code in the leaflet that's on your seats. And I hope what we're going to hear now from experts across the panel is a real commitment to taking this forward, and that sort of universal provision that Andrea was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I very much agree with what Andrea and John said, so I'm not going to repeat what they've said. I think Family Hub's agenda is absolutely crucial. I think someone's mentioned it takes a village to raise a child. We've kind of lost that village in many parts of the country. We've lost that muscle memory of how to parent children collectively, and I think Family Hubs is a brilliant way to try and rebuild that muscle memory of how to be a village raising a child. So I fully support that agenda, and I'll probably the same event will be at lunchtime. But I suppose I want to take a bit of a different tack, really, instead of repeating what others have said. And I want to pick up on something Andrea said about mothers. So Andrea mentioned that human babies are unique in how helpless and undeveloped they are when they're born, because their heads have to be so big for our brains, and they have to get out at a point when they still can. But that means human mothers are also unique. Nurturing a baby takes an enormous amount of self-sacrifice from a mother's point of view. The mother has to deny her own desire for resources, for sleep, for independence, her own physical well-being in order to care for that child. And probably for 2, 3 or even more years, very much the mother's own needs have to be subservient to that of the baby. And that is a highly evolved function in both the baby and the mother. And that's why mothers and babies have this incredibly strong bond. When the baby's born and over that first 2 or 3 years, it's a physical as well as an emotional bond. Anyone who's breastfed will know that when your baby cries, even if it's in a different room, your breast starts to produce milk. When your baby cries, not another baby. Isn't that an incredible evolutionary mechanism for having that bond with your own baby? So I want to argue not just that it matters how the baby is looked after in the first 2 years of life, because of course that matters immensely, but who looks after that baby. And I think, of course, there are many examples of babies who, for whatever reason, couldn't be looked after by their own biological mother, and those babies are well cared for and go on to have successful life. Of course, there are those people. But in the vast majority of the time, for the vast majority of the society, mum is the best person for all sorts of biological reasons to look after the baby. And I think sometimes we've been quite political about this. It wouldn't have been controversial to say this 25 years ago, perhaps now. But we've got caught up in this kind of feminist agenda that says that motherhood is secondary to going out to work, to having a career, to having some sort of status in society that depends on your value from GDP. But actually, it is a biological fact. You know, mums are the best people to look after their babies for very good reasons. So my question is, how can we enable more mums to have the choice to look after their baby themselves and be supported more of the time? And I think at the moment, many mums face an impossible choice. We have this total policy gap between 6 months, when most people's maternity pay runs out, and 3 years when childcare vouchers start. It's just a gap. What do? Do you live in poverty for 2.5 years? Do you go out to work but spend the vast majority of your income on very expensive, because it has to be low ratio childcare, essentially putting your child in the care of strangers in, some nurseries are great, some are more like holding rooms. The sacrifice for a mother at that point is absolutely enormous, but most mums have no choice. And let's remember that whilst it's brilliant that women can have careers now, and I, for one, welcome that, it's an amazing opportunity, most women don't have careers, they have jobs. And if you're stacking shelves at the supermarket, is it a good trade-off to pay all of that £10 an hour into substandard childcare and break that bond between you and your baby, or at least stretch it in a very difficult way? So many mums at 6 months or a year, or whenever their maternity pay ends, face an almost impossible choice. And so what I would like to see the government do, on top of everything that Andrea said, of course, is to fix this policy gap. Now, in most countries in the world, most comparable Western countries, people are taxed in a very different way than we are here. So we have this individualistic taxation system since the 1980s, where the Treasury only sees us as individuals. So if you earn $60,000 a year, the Treasury sees you as a very well-off person, will have your higher rate tax, thank you very much, and you can lose all your child benefits. Now, all they're seeing is an individual. They have no idea how many people, how many children that wage has to support. And so you end up with these huge inequalities in tax. So let's say in House A, you've got a couple with no children, both earning £49,000 a year. They're both on the basic rate of tax, and they keep the vast majority of their income. Their combined gross income is £98,000 a year. Next door, you've got a household of 6. Dad works, mum doesn't, because it doesn't make sense for her to go back to work because the cost of childcare would be so much. Dad earns £53,000 a year. He pays a high rate of tax. He loses his child benefit. They lose all sorts of other benefits, and they may get some benefits back, but the effective marginal tax rate on that, because every time you earn £1 more, you lose so much back, is just phenomenal. That house is actually in the lowest third by prosperity in this country, even though the Treasury sees that family or indeed that individual as wealthy. Now, we are a complete outlier in this. Other countries, Germany, France, Canada, the US, tax people as households or families, or they have some shared tax allowances, or they have allowances for each child. And our tax system does not recognise at all the value of parenthood, the value that it brings to society, the cost that it saves further down the line if children are able to grow up in a safe home with a strong bond with their parents. And I think during the leadership election, Liz Truss did actually start to talk about some sort of shared allowances for parents of young children. So what I really want to see is that policy developed, for us to have something along the lines of Canada or Germany, where you can be taxed as a family, where you can have some of that money back in those early years to make sure mum particularly, it doesn't have to be mum, but normally it will be, can stay at home, can invest in that strong bond. And when I say stay at home, I think that, we all know what that means, stay at home mum. But when I was a stay at home mum, I was out the house as much as possible. I think what keeps you going as a young mum of tiny babies is seeing other mums, grandparents, going to baby groups. And I think that's something that the Start for Life offer, the Family Hubs, and hopefully start to kickstart again, so that when we do have more mums able to not work before their child is 3, they've got something to do and enjoy parenting together with. So I suppose completely agree with everything that's been said so far, but I would add into that, let's change our tax system to recognise that.
Getting a lot of nods in the room there, so I'm sure we'll come back to that in questions. I want to hand over to you now, Carey.
Thank you, and really interesting, and I lots of kind of shared ideas. I've been working for the Nuffield Foundation over the last 3 years, and we've been very focused on how families are changing and how the lives of young children are changing. And the foundation funds research, and what we wanted to do is to make sure that that research is useful to help us make good policy decisions, but also to inform practice. So that's what I'm drawing on when I talk in this brief bit now. What I thought I'd focus on is what, we were asked a number of questions as panel members. What would the best early years support look like? So the first thing, and that's very much reflected in what others have said, is I think we need to have a rounded and a holistic approach when we think about young children. And it's the way young children develop, and Andrea, you express it incredibly powerfully, is that they, how they learn and their physical development and their social and emotional development are all very, very, very closely intertwined. So we know, for instance, communication and language is important not only for reading and literacy, but also in terms of managing your emotions, both as a baby and as a toddler and right into adult life. So thinking about how do we then make sure that the services that we provide as a society and communities actually reflect that adequately. A second key principle for me is thinking that we need to think about how we support parents' capabilities. So a lot of the things, Sally's going to go and talk about, but a lot of the things that have already been mentioned, how do we support the mothers and fathers' mental health and the relationships that go on within a home, and the parenting skills and the home learning environment, all things that there's some new initiatives going on which are very, very promising. But also, how do we reduce the pressures on parents at the same time? And that's obviously both about the economic situation that people are in, their health, and their time, which again comes back to what you were saying, Miriam. How do we, parents also need time. Mothers need time, and so in many households, fathers need time to be able to help and support their young children. And the key issue, I guess, for policymakers and those who are delivering services, how do we balance that? Because actually we need both. How you parent is also affected by that wider context. And then the third principle is really how do we work alongside families in order for them to access the help they need. So John, you talked about this about take-up. We've got this early 2-year-old childcare offer for disadvantaged children. We've got at least 1 in 3 families are not accessing that. And really trying to get underneath the skin of why they're not. How do we support people to get the help that really could help them? And I think there's a lot more we could do in that territory. And the third principle is really, and that's really what Start for Life is really doing, is how we think about how we join up those services. How do we do things in a timely way? We know that these key transitions, like when you become pregnant, or when your child begins nursery, or when they start school, or when there's a relationship breakup, all these things are critical moments to intervene. But because we don't actually gather the data very successfully, whether that's through the opportunities now we have through the Red Book and becoming digital, we don't know what's happening with the parent, and we don't connect it up with the child. And I really think we could get a lot from being able to do that better in terms of timing that support. And then I just wanted to add a point really about, I do think it's important for us to think about poverty alongside of these things. that when we're thinking about how we join up services, we often think about health, and we think to some extent about early education and childcare. But there's a financial circumstances that families find themselves in are also really important. And I think there's a lot we could do whether at local level, so getting people to take up the benefits that are available for them, as well as making sure that they take up the free offer. So the system could work much better. And I just really wanted to kind of end with, people might want to talk a bit about childcare in early years. I'd really like Best Start for Life to actually go from pregnancy to the age of 5. That would be my sense of a connected vision with different parts of the system working together, and also for us to think about how that's led politically. We need some ministerial representation of early childhood, actually, I think, for it to really have weight. And maybe there's some ways in which, how do we create incentives? I'm thinking in terms of central government. How do we create incentives to get that join up? Is there a way in which you can sort of top slice some money across the different departments, which is sort of reserved for early childhood? We're in difficult times. There's not much money to spend. But it seems to me that if we want to create a society that is resilient, that's just and productive, early childhood's it's really a vital part of that. So we really need to be thinking, how do we incentivise and get different services, different parts of the system to work together? It'd be great to be able to kind of come back and talk a bit about early education and childcare. One of the things is just a bit of a plea. Obviously, it's key that childcare supports people to go into work, but it's also about early education and development and the quality of it. And I think in the debate and reform, lots of opportunities for reform, it's really important not to lose that. So, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll pick up on that theme about early education and questions, but I want to hand over to Miss Sally before opening up so everyone start thinking about your questions. Over to Sally.
Thank you very much. I'm Sally Smith. I'm the CEO of the charity Peeple, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. There's obviously a lot of consensus, I think, in the panel here about a lot of things that we're talking about. Clearly, if you didn't know before today, you do now, that our brains are built and not born, that every interaction that we have with a baby shapes the neural connections that influence how they develop, how they feel, how they think, and that most of this shaping actually happens before the child is 2, just as Andrea was saying. If you have a background in early years, and I suspect that quite a few of you here probably do, then you will definitely know that. But actually, most people don't, most parents don't. Most parents simply don't have that knowledge about how children learn and develop. At Peeple, we work with families in a disadvantaged part of Oxford, and we train practitioners from around the UK to use our programmes. I'm going to read you something that one of our parents said when she came to one of our Peep groups. She said, "Coming to Peep changed my life. When my son was born, I didn't know what to do. I tried so hard, but he was always crying. I thought he hated me. At Peep, I learned that all that crying was him trying to talk to me, but without words. It was like a light bulb going on. I stopped panicking every time he cried and tried to imagine what he wanted to say." The Peep Learning Together programme, which we developed, is based on the research that Andrea's just been talking about, that consistent, responsive, sensitive interactions with our caregivers are really important, but also that a rich home learning environment, and that's not educational toys, it's not teaching your children, but it's opportunities for play, talk, books, stories, rhymes. These things are important for all children, but particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. It gives them that little incentive, little change, which can help them buck the trend and do well, not just at school, but throughout life. Our programme, shares this knowledge about child development with parents and ideas for how to put that knowledge into practice through simple, everyday, no-cost activities and interactions. It's about upskilling parents, but it's strengths-based. It starts with what parents are already doing. and explains to them why what they're already doing is helpful. So if they let their child play with yogurt when they're having their lunch, we can explain to them that's actually really helping their child learn to write. So it doesn't tell parents what to do, but it gives them knowledge, and that gives them choices about what they might do. So I think the Learning Together is a fabulous programme, but it's just one of many excellent parenting programmes that are available. But none of these programmes are magic bullets. They shouldn't exist in a vacuum, and they're only as good as the practitioner who delivers them. And that quality from the practitioner depends on the support and the supervision that's available to them. Families want support from trusted professionals who don't judge them. And these relationships often take sustained effort to build. And there's so little time for this in the system that we have at the moment. So, like everybody else, I'm totally behind the need for a statutory cross-sector infrastructure of services with ring-fenced funding, so local authorities can't choose to go and spend it on something else, that provides pathways of support from open access universal provision to much more intensive targeted provision that's offered before a crisis is developed. And this should be an entitlement for every family, as fundamental as school. I think we all agree with that. And it should include early learning and childcare options that are affordable for working parents, but that deliver that high quality nurturing care and learning opportunities, which are vital for all children, but really do make a difference for the children most at risk of underachievement. And what's happening now just isn't good enough. It really isn't. Nurseries and preschools are closing every week because of lack of funding, and family support comes too late at the moment. It's coming after the problems have emerged. So our earliest experiences really do make a difference to the lives that we lead and influence how we parent the next generation. And we should see, I think we all agree, that an effective infrastructure for family support in the early years is an investment for the future and not a cost for society. But for this infrastructure to really work, I think we also need a change in our mindset. Research from the Royal Foundation found that 75% of the public are not aware of the special significance of the earliest years for later development. So I think we need a public health campaign that is going to nudge us towards a different understanding at social level about the importance of early years, so that everyone understands that importance, that they're the foundation of the resilience that we need to cope with life's ups and downs and to really live our best lives, but also for a better and more equitable society that will benefit us all.
Brilliant, thank you guys so much. And so we're going to throw it straight over to questions. If you've got questions, put your hand up. Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to start off in the back in a black and white dress with dots on, and there's going to be a microphone coming to you. Can you just say your name and your organisation and what your question is?
Hi there, my name is Catherine Coffey. I'm from What Works for Children's Social Care. It's really fantastic to hear you talk so much about early intervention and roll out family hubs. It'd be really great just to get your thoughts on the implementation of the care review in terms of how we can support children when they do enter care, whether that's staying with a family member in kinship care, or whether that's living with a foster carer, or whatever case so those children can't stay with their mothers, and how best we can support them to achieve the best things for them.
Brilliant. I'm going to go to Andrea to answer that one.
I mean, I personally feel that we do in society spend an awful lot of time trying again. So babies whose parents are in great difficulty, or whose parent is in great difficulty, the baby may be taken away and then given back, and then taken away and then given back several times. And there are parents who have multiple children who all end up being taken away. And in my view, that fundamentally needs to change. There is an element of it being all about the parents, and the parents want to keep the baby, of course they do. And the reality is that every baby is attached to their parent, whether insecure, secure, or disorganised. So every baby wants to stay with his or her parent, even when they're being cruelly abused. And I think that we have to get more realistic about that, and we have to look at it from the baby's point of view. And so, in my view, we ought to do far more. I think if we're far more focused on the period from conception to age 2, then it will be possible to make better decisions, hence safeguarding being a part of the universal support in a family hub. It's not to stigmatise people, but it's to recognise that this is about the outcomes for the baby. And therefore, if you are on drugs when you're pregnant, and you're still on drugs when the baby's born, and you're still on drugs by the time the baby's 6 months old, then actually your baby should be being taken away from you, because that's in the interests of the baby. And I think at the moment, it's too much toing and froing, and what happens is babies' lives are ruined, their potential is impaired, and they end up being taken away into care at sort of 4 or 5 when there's so much damage done to them, and it gets much, much harder for them to be adopted into a happy, secure family. And then obviously for children, even later on, which again is often the fault of inaction earlier on, they end up just staying in care, and the worst results are for those who spend a life in care. So I think a bit of tough love is actually needed, but I think the care review is very important. But I would say we need to be taking away more babies than we are right now.
I want to go to you, Miriam, then to you, John.
I completely agree with Andrea. I think if it's not possible for the baby to be safe and nurtured with biological parents, the sooner they're taken away and get the opportunity to form another secure attachment is really important. I think, just on a different point, I mean, it's a while since I read the recommendations, so I don't want to make up the detail. But from what I remember, I mean, I very much broadly agree with it. And I think the problem that we have with implementing it, as with many of these other policies, is that Treasury rules prevent government from spending money now that will pay dividends in, let's say, 15 or 20 years' time. And in all these things, whether it's early years, care for babies in social care, or even changing the tax system, we won't see the dividends until the current cohort of babies are adults. And now, for me, it's well worth investing, because the transformation will be enormous. But really, the barrier we've got is, will Treasury allow that money to be spent? So I think that's probably the work of parliamentarians to try and convince the government that they do need to invest money in this. I think also there needs to be a much bigger role for civil society. There's a charity who I think, they call Homes for Good, who place children in kind of church family settings. So one family in the church takes on the adoption or the fostering, but the rest of the church commit to supporting that family, because it's a big deal to take on an adopted child. It's even more demanding than having your own baby, which is demanding enough. So I think those kind of ideas of a community-based solution also should be looked at, and the government should be encouraging that, whether that's through funding or legally or whatever that may be.
Well, John and Sally.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think you can come at this from different ends and end up in the same place. And I think there's a framing for this which is about the rights of the child. And the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child doesn't start at 3 or 5; it starts for all children. And so I think the framing of that is important. And then, I mean, just an anecdote from my previous role working with homeless adults. The constant frustration of that entire sector is they work incredibly hard to develop trauma-informed services for adults. And because of this, the research that says adverse childhood experiences are predictors of future problems, not just homelessness. But and the frustration was, well, why not make the intervention when the adverse experience happens? Why make the intervention 30 years later in a brilliant trauma-informed service? And just to put some money around the return, globally, our research suggests that you spend £1 on early years, you get 13 back.
Sally, I know she wanted to come in on that one too.
Just briefly to add that once the child has been adopted, I think it's important that family gets additional support, because of the reason that the child will have had these adverse childhood experiences almost by default. And I've seen so many examples where the new family are delighted, they've got their child, sometimes sisters, siblings, and then they really, really struggle, and they don't really understand why.
Great. I'm going to take 3 questions at once. So I'm going to take the red dress here with flowers on, and then the blue suit, and then right at the back, black sweater, I think.
Thank you all very much for today. Janet Fisher from Live Music Now, and for a little context, we work in early years and with disabled children and young people as they go through our education system. Given we have a patchy take-up of services and we have this 1 in 3 families in deprived areas not uptaking their statutory rights, and given that we know that music, and I normally am on the culture policy, but here it is absolutely music, has huge neurocognitive benefits in early years and in childhood development, and also that music organizations have deeply embedded partnerships in deprived areas with those families that are not accessing our services. What do we think is the need, the place, and the investment for the use of music and cultural services within these family hubs, and that it's implemented as part of the very framework of that, rather than as an afterthought when we suddenly think, oh, that would be quite nice to have, let's have some Delcros and some Eurythmics later. So I think it's a question around what do you think you could invest in, how can that be implemented into the fabric of these new hubs?
And then just right here.
My name is Jonathan Smith. I'm representing myself. I'm from Kettering, close to Andrea's constituency. The context for my question is that I've spent over 10 years teaching gymnastics, predominantly to young boys, but also occasionally to girls. And also, the secondary context of my question is that my nephew was born in March 2020. So everyone can figure out what that means in terms of the calendar. And when I first met him a year and a half after his birth, that he was genuinely scared of me. And as somebody who has spent a great deal of time with young boys especially, it wasn't normal shyness, which you often get at boys at sort of the ages I've dealt with. This was genuine uncertainty and fear, because he just wasn't used to any form of sort of external stimulus other than his two parents. And my concern is that John mentioned it very briefly in his remarks, that we recognise this might be a problem, but we don't really know what it is. And it sort of feels like the policy direction that we seem to be adopting is almost to, I mean this with the most respect, to treat these children almost like a science experiment, which is that when they get to about 4 or 5 and teachers start interacting with them, we'll figure out how to deal with it, but we're not actually proactively sort of addressing what I think is a very serious but one-off problem, which is that we have a generation, as almost all the panels have said, their first 2 years were very, very strange. And we're not really adopting anything other than, well, we'll wait and see what happens to these kids. And as somebody who's spent a lot of time around 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds teaching gymnastics, I'd be one of the first on the front line to actually have to deal with that. I'm not overly enthusiastic about that, me being the test case of trying to figure out what it is without other people coming in first. So I'd be very welcome to hear what the panel thinks about that.
Really, thank you. Final question at the back. If you can just keep it succinct, because I want to do one more round after this. That's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the fact that there is this consensus building around the 1,000 days, and this should be a cross-party investment programme. Another programme which is hugely supportive to parents around nutrition is the Healthy Start initiative. And we estimate around, I'm Barbara Cragg from the Children's Food Campaign. We're a coalition of health and education and early years organisations. We estimate about 300,000 families are currently not taking up their eligibility, but even more worryingly, at the moment, under universal credit, in order to be eligible for those vouchers, which are now worth £4.25 a week, and it's a Conservative government that increased the value after 10 years of no increase, so thank you for that. You have to be earning less than £408 a week of take-home pay in order to be eligible for those vouchers. And the cost of living increases, and the cost of infant formula has risen around twice the rate of the cost of food price inflation. So 2 things really is in thinking about how we invest. If we invested between 80 and 130 million pounds in raising the value to make sure families can afford fruit and vegetables or infant formula, we could get £13 back for every pound we invest in that for a relatively minor investment. So I really agree with Miriam, let's look at this long-term investment, but also let's address the value of Healthy Start as part of the current cost of living package. And I'd really love to hear what the panel thinks.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to start off with Jenna's question about music in family hubs, and I'm going to come to you, Carey, to answer on that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I guess what it raises, again, is the importance, I mean, a number of the questions do that, actually, because you talked about music, gymnastics and food. And it makes you realise that this phase of life between, conception and 5 requires us to think holistically about children's different needs. And in terms of, it made me think also about special educational needs in general, and how we know that the take-up of services for children with those difficulties is lower than for others. And that often early years provision is not able to accommodate those needs. So it seems to me both about the potential for music to reach children in different ways, and I'm sure that's right that we underestimate that and don't give that due weight, but also the importance of really thinking, how do we get our existing services and family hubs and so on to support those children who are particularly likely to benefit, and also their parents to need that extra support. We know that children who have a disability, or parents with a disability, it has major consequences for how you parent and your ability to engage with work and so on. So music, very important. I just wanted to just pick up the question about COVID. Babies are born during the COVID period, and young children growing up during that period. Obviously, we know actually the evidence already is that children have really suffered, and it was not a central focus of policy. Of course, people were very focused on managing the pandemic, and also focused on older people in general because they were more at risk, and a lot of conversation about schools because it was very obvious that children were not in it, but much less focus on early childhood over that period. And we know we have this evidence from Ofsted, where actually early years teachers, or all those who are working with young children, can really see how they've fallen behind, particularly on communication and language. And so government has committed quite a large sum of money in relation to catch up. Some of that is for early childhood, but a relatively limited amount. So I think understanding what it is that people need who are working on the front line, as you are and others, what kind of training do some of those early years workforce need to be able to address the particular issues that are raised by the pandemic? How we support families with those young children to catch up as a result of the consequences of the pandemic. And you're right, we can't just wait to see what happens. And of course, right now, many of the people who are working with young children are doing that. I mean, they're putting in extra hours to try to meet those children's needs. And I think also it illustrates just the importance of those services, what happens when those services aren't there or are much more interrupted, as well as the importance of wider social contact within families. So, the fact that you can see grandparents or your auntie or other friends. You can go to playgrounds for a period of time when if you've got limited amount of space, that was just is a huge problem. So that we don't yet know what the consequences are, and we do have to meet those needs to enable people to catch up.
Thanks, Carey. Andrea, I think the question's kind of centred on the issues and strains that families are finding themselves under at the moment. I wondered if either you or Miriam wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, across the piece, one thing I didn't talk about with the early years review is that our action area number 4 is to change the system so that the workforce, such as it is now, is vastly different in the future. So at the moment, everyone knows what a midwife is and what a health visitor is, but people don't know about the Healthy Start programme. People don't know about the grandparents who run drop-ins. People just about know what Home Start is. So there's all kinds of different jobs in the early years space that aren't joined up. So the joined up services goes right across the piece, and I certainly think a big part of parenting programmes is going to be about nutrition. And I always remember Alison Morton, who was head of the Institute of Health Visiting, telling me that she went to the home of a young woman who was proudly telling her that she was now giving her 3-month-old Cocoa Pops because she loves her so much, she wants her to have the best. And she was like, You know, that therein lies the kind of problem. But also, I would say that in this country, we have some of the lowest breastfeeding rates in Western Europe, and very, very often the emotional problems and the guilt feelings of mums are around being unable, not supported to breastfeed when they desperately want to. And that is a big deal, hence there's a lot of focus. We're calling it infant feeding so as not to be stigmatising, but ultimately is to try to empower and help many more women who want to, by the way, to actually feel that they can breastfeed and do it, you know, in a way that they feel good about and is so beneficial to their babies.
Thank you. I'm going to try and take 2 more questions. So, oh, there's way more than 2 questions. I'll try to do 3. So I'm going to take this one and jump out the front second row. Blue cardigan, I think, right at the back there. And then on this side, the woman in the grey jumper. So if you could just say your name and your question and try to succinct.
Hi, Michelle from the Paul Hamlin Foundation. So my question is the current kind of context of economic growth and how that sits with the conversations that we're having today, which is perhaps longer term interventions and strategy. I just went to a session around how to level up the labour markets, and there was a concept, there was an idea of economically inactive people and how to get them into work. So my question is, how is there a heightened risk of the stuff we're talking about today being lower down the kind of policy intervention government strategy over the next few years?
And then just at the back. Okay.
Amanda McIntyre from the For Baby's Sake Trust. Our For Baby's Sake programme is the first to work in a trauma-informed and attachment-focused way with both parents, starting in pregnancy and continuing until the baby is 2, to break the cycle of domestic abuse and to give their baby the best start in life when those parents really, really did not have the best start in life themselves. You know, I am in awe of the changes that the mums and the dads make during the journey of the programme, to their own behaviour, to their emotional regulation, and the way they bond with their baby, including, in many cases, keeping their baby when maybe they've had previously, their children have been removed. And so my question, not every family needs this level of support, but some really do. So my question is, how do we make sure that there is recognition and realism about what it takes to support families with intergenerational trauma histories genuinely to break the cycle? And how do we make sure then that that recognition of what it takes flows through into investment decisions, commissioning decisions, and public policy? Thanks.
And one more question there.
Hello, my name is Wendy Whisker-Large. I used to be a Short Start Programme Manager, during which time I did a master's degree in early years, and then I ended up teaching early years at university. I also have 4 children, 2 of which have cystic fibrosis, so I've got lots of experience in early years. When I was working in Short Start, I, as a programme manager, was able to evaluate a lot of different aspects of our programme. And I would say to you that the biggest impact that anything had was education. And one of the things I would really like to understand from the panel is to what degree can we embed a new hegemony about early years in our culture through the national curriculum, through ongoing adult education, through easy accessibility education for parents who themselves have been through cycles of deprivation, as have their parents and their parents before them. What I saw break that chain was giving women particularly education on basic maths, literature, English, skills that they had missed out on at school, and being able to then grow themselves. And as a Conservative, I believe in freedom and choice, and that's what I think we should be pushing and really embedding education at all ages, including parents, because they are the ones who make the biggest impacts in their own children's lives.
Thanks, Andrea. So, Miriam, I'm going to come to you actually for question 1 and question 3. So, on economic inactivity and also on education, world education.
Fair to say. Yeah. Well, in terms of will this agenda be pushed down because of all the early economic growth? Well, the truth is we can't afford to be. We do need to grow. Like all Western economies, even before lockdowns and the recent trauma in the markets, our economies are screwed. I mean, by 2060, pre-pandemic, the OBR predicted that our debt to GDP ratio would be about 300%, which is obviously completely impossible because we have an ageing society, healthcare gets more and more expensive, and we don't have enough babies. So, you know, we are on a very, very destructive trajectory as a Western economy, with or without COVID and the other things that have been thrown at us. So we have got to grow. I mean, we either have major austerity or we have got to put everything on growth. So I agree that's what we've got to do, but even that's not enough. Because what we've got to do is reduce demand on the state. So in 1947, when the welfare state was created, women didn't work. There was no state paid for childcare, no state paid for social care, and only basic healthcare. The community did the rest. You might have started work at 14, you retired at 60, you died at 65. Now you spend probably over half your working life not working. So our standard of living is completely unsustainable unless we have a rebuilding of the social capital that allows us to take demand off the state. And that means stronger families, being able to look after your own old people, and early interventions to make sure people are healthier and wealthier later in life. So the truth is we cannot afford to lose this agenda because we cannot meet our economic needs without going down these programs. So I hope it's high up on the government's agenda, but it's going to have to be, and the same in other Western countries. Moving on to the second question, about education, that one. Yes, and I think this is why I don't particularly think that government money spending on getting deprived children out of their homes without their parents is money well spent. Because whilst I accept that, sending some 2-year-olds to a nursery is better for them in that moment than being at home. It doesn't achieve anything because it doesn't educate their parent. So I love this idea of giving parents a voucher so they can spend on musical education, let's say, with their child, so that they are also learning good habits of parenting at the same time as their child having a good experience. Because I think the goal here has to be to coach parents, not to take the child away and give the child a better experience. So I would spend all our money on vouchers instead of going to nurseries to give parents the choice. Because in deprived community, you have less of the mums and baby groups, the toddler groups, the singing groups. So they're the communities that need it even more. And so I think that's what the government money should be going to, because then parents are also being educated at the same time and not just the child.
Really, really interesting idea there, Miriam. And just finally, I'm going to pass to Andrea to answer on how do we break the cycle.
Yeah, so absolutely key to this is universal services. The one piece of strong evidence that came out of Sure Starts is that they became very targeted, which is fine if you know who to target, but of course you don't. So making family hubs as commonly used as the GP surgery, the library, that's absolutely vital. Then you can identify who needs the most help and focus on them. Parenting programs, that is all about education. In my opinion, Key Stage 2 ought to include how does the human mind develop, alongside photosynthesis, and before you get into the subject of bottoms and willies and things like that, which is too exciting. So much, much younger, talk about how the human minds develop. And then the other thing I think is something that the Early Years Review is rolling out, and that's trauma-informed care e-learning modules for everybody working in the early years space, and supervision. So those two things would go a long way, I think, to ensuring that the help is targeted where it's needed, because you'll have a much more sensitive work and volunteer force who are able to identify where the real problems are.
Brilliant. I think that's all we have time for today. I'm so sorry about that, but if you can all join us in a round of applause for our brilliant panel.